All right, I was actually motivated by reading a tweet by Brick75 and Peter Overzet that talks about a solution to breaking up ties in sports with a lot of duplicates in DFS. And I actually went over this in one of my little podcasts with Bobby a few months ago, but it just kind of got lost or whatever. We didn't really talk too much about it, but because they're kind of bringing it up, I figured I would go over this again. And the idea actually does have an interesting flaw, which if you guys listen and work it out, you kind of figure out what it might be. I don't know if it's a fatal flaw, but we'll get to that in a minute. The idea comes from horse racing, and horse racing has this thing called a pick six, where what happens is people try to select six races in a row and can bet multiple horses in every race if they want. And what happens is if nobody hits pick six during the day, let's say no one hits six winners, that money kind of gets carried over to the next day and people kind of fight for a bigger prize pool. Now, within the past several years, there's been a new development in pick six wagering, something called a jackpot pick six. And what that does is reserves a part of the pick six pool for the person who can be the only person to pick six. Like if you are the lone person in the entire planet that picks six winners that day, you get the jackpot pool. Okay. And if a whole bunch of people pick six that day, then the jackpot part doesn't get paid out and gets carried over to the next day. Okay. So it's an incredible idea for horse racing, which has developed a lot of business. And I think it could work in DFS. So you think about it, this is the way it would work. With sports like, whatever it is that has natural duplication, what you do is you take a percentage of the prize pool, we call it the jackpot pool, call it whatever you want, say 30% of the pool, which is what they do in horse racing. And they put that part aside for the person if they have the highest score all by themselves. Okay. So if you are the top score is one person, that person gets the entire 30% of the pool. Okay. Now, if there is a tie at the top, whether it be 2 players, 8 players, 37 players, whatever, then the 30% of the prize pool carries over to the next day, and the 70% that remains just gets distributed in the normal way that it gets distributed. Okay. So the impact of that is that unless you end up picking the top score by yourself, the rest of the wager kind of becomes negative EV, right? Because if you're taking 30% off of the top, then it's a lot to overcome. But what happens is if you do get that sole unique score by yourself at the top, you get the 30% of the entire prize pool. But what happens is what's really cool is that day after day, this jackpot pool just builds and builds and builds. And in horse racing, for example, you can get up to millions of dollars in before someone hits the top, score all by themselves. So what they end up having to do is after a certain period of time, have a giveaway day where they just have to give the entire prize pool out. So what would happen in DFS, now again, the sites would have to figure out the best way to do this, like how many days they would let this roll before they could have to give it away is, I mean, think about it. Let's say they put there's this contest, they have $100,000 in it or whatever, and 30,000 is set aside for the top prize if they win it all by themselves. So let's say that's a tie between 3 people. Well, then that 30,000 goes into the next day. So that let's say the second day, you have this new money fighting for that $30,000 jackpot plus 30% of what's waged on that day as well. So for those of you that are sharp, you kind of see what's going on here. This jackpot pool keeps getting built and built and built, and it encourages people to try to go for lineups that are going to be sole unique lineups, because even if there's a tie between one other person, then that entire 30% just can't be paid out that day and gets carried over. So I think it's a really, really good idea in sports like, I don't know, auto racing or MMA, whatever you guys think. But this idea of having that part of each prize pool reserved for the sole unique winner, I think is I don't know. I think it's interesting. So just to kind of put it up here, and this is just kind of a whatchamacallit, I didn't even do a PowerPoint or anything, but again, so you have the prize pool, the rake just comes out right away. And then 30% of that would go to the the sole top score. It's got to be a unique score. 70% will go to the rest of the pool, which would distribute it in the normal way that, that results get distributed. And then if no one has the unique top score, that pool, that part of it carries over to the next day. And then eventually, if the sites think it's appropriate, they can have a giveaway day where all that money that's piled up in the jackpot pool gets put in the regular pool and they distribute it like a normal tournament, okay? So the problem is gonna be this. If you guys wanna pause this for a second and try to think of what the flaw could be, I don't know if you consider it a flaw, but it is incredibly disadvantageous to ever have your lineups duplicated, right? Because if you're playing in a pool where you're going for that jackpot and you're going to be the only person, then it's really against everybody's best interest to tell anybody who they're picking, right? So, if for content providers, if they go out and say, "Listen, I think this is a good bet in the jackpot today," then if anybody else bets it, you're automatically negative EV. You know what I mean? So in that sense, it's really, really tricky. The other thing it encourages is, I wouldn't say encourages it or whatever, but it certainly makes it advantageous for, whoa, one sec. See, this is going on in the background right now. That's what I'm thinking about. Right. Sorry, I just paused for a second there. So what happens is it really does encourage people to, I don't want to say collude, but to at least make sure that they're not putting in the same lineup as somebody else, right? Because otherwise, an instant negative EV, even more so than your normal DFS tournament where it might be negative EV to duplicate a lineup. In this case, there would certainly be incredible negative EV to know that you're being duplicated. But I think the idea is very interesting, and with that one particular flaw not exception, for that one particular drawback for content providers, I guess, I think this is an interesting way to approach these types of contests where you can have a lot of duplication.